So I'm now really pleased to introduce Professor Jonathan Roiser, our second main speaker today. Jonathan is a professor of neuroscience and mental health at University College London, where he co-directs a research group. I know Jonathan is going to take us on a fascinating journey into a complex and often misunderstood around area of mental health science. So again, please have your questions ready in whatever form you like, and please welcome Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for the first two presenters for really fascinating and very important lessons. I'm learning a huge amount this evening. So I guess we've kind of heard the bad news, and my brief maybe is here to give you a bit of the good news. So maybe I'm going to try and put a little bit of an optimistic spin on it. And you can see my lovely AI-generated picture of people running on the beach in the sunset there. So it's not exactly representative, but you're going to get the basic idea. So I have spent 20 years studying depression at the level of the brain, depression at the level of our psychological architecture, depression at the level of people's biology, depression at the level of society and social influences. We have to think about all of these things if we're going to be able to understand complex mental health problems. I'm not a specialist in severe mental illness by any means. I did do several years of schizophrenia research in the past, so I'm mainly going to focus on depression. But of course, as we heard, depression can be incredibly severe and lifelong, and indeed life-threatening. So I think that's an important start. But I will talk about severe mental illness and physical activity towards the end of my talk, because I think there's actually some really interesting findings there as well. So I'm just going to start by putting some acknowledgements up, because I do this very interdisciplinary work, and let me tell you, it is a huge, huge team effort. So there's all these people who are involved, and I'm not going to have time to name each of them, and what's going to happen is I'm going to run out of time to show all my slides, so I have to put them up at the beginning, and of course also our funders, and in particular here I'm going to present work from the Roiser Foundation and Wellcome Trust funding. So let's just get the basics out of the way, which is around the importance of physical activity. And of course, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but nonetheless, let's just look at the data, because they're really quite incredible. So at the top, on the right-hand side of the figure there, you can see an amazing study from the US, an epidemiological study looking at the relationship between the amount of physical activity people are doing. They've called it exercise here, but don't think exercise just means going to the gym, of course. We're talking about going on a brisk walk, walking the dog, running for the bus, going swimming, whatever it is, any form of physical activity, and the reported number of poor mental health days in a month. So that's basically what that graph is showing. And what you can see, and this is in a population of about 1.2 million people. So this is a reliable piece of data here. And what you can see is that for people who are really sedentary, you have many more poor mental health days, but that actually starts to improve really quite dramatically, even with a small amount of physical activity. And I often get asked this, by people, how much activity is right? And the answer is some is better than nothing, and it gets a little bit better as you do a little bit more. But actually, only to a point, as you can see. So once you get to 12 days, 12 bouts, if you like, in a month, then it kind of levels off, and that actually is very interesting. Corresponds with actually the NICE guidelines on how much physical activity is good for mental health. Very interestingly, and then what happens at the end? So don't go to the gym every day, because that's not looking good. So actually, you see this real uptick at the end, and that's probably from people who really exercise compulsively, probably because they've got poor mental health problems, maybe using it as a coping strategy. So that's the first thing to say. And as a result of this, and also randomized controlled trials, which is the next figure I'm going to show you, physical activity, we know it's effective for depression, and it's recommended by the NHS, recommended by NICE. It's there in the guidelines for treatment for depression. In principle, anybody going to their doctor for treatment for depression could be prescribed physical activity, but actually doesn't happen very often. But in principle, in the same way as I was once prescribed physical activity for a bad back, and it was provided for free by the NHS, in principle, that's a service that should be available for mental health within the NHS as well, according to the guidelines. And then, well, so the top figure there, could be causation, could be correlation. It's very hard to tease apart cause and effect. What can we do about that? Well, we run trials. So we run randomized controlled trials. That's the best way of figuring out cause and effect. And this is a fantastic piece of work published just last year This is the paper by Notel at the bottom, if anyone is interested. And they looked at every trial ever done for physical activity, any type of physical activity in depression, and looked to see how they compare with each other. And what's the take-home message here? Actually, it doesn't really matter what you do. So you get slightly different effect size. Some look a little bit more effective than others, like walking or jogging looks to be pretty much as effective as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an amazing result. But also things like, just doing strength training or, even Tai Chi or Qigong. These are all effective, and if you look at the bottom there, you can see antidepressant medication, which is effective, and I don't want to go on some kind of crusade against antidepressants. They can be very effective and life-saving, but they don't seem to produce as strong effects as many types of different physical activity. So that's my kind of starting point. We're sort of taking it as read that physical activity is actually very, very good for your mental health, probably about as good for mental health as it is for physical health, which isn't surprising because we know they're linked with each other. So we know there's a very substantial effect on symptoms in people with diagnosed depression and all across the spectrum as well. And this works in people who, in hospital for depression, people in community settings. It works individual exercise, group-based exercise, basically any form of physical activity is going to be good for your mental health. So where I'm interested is, because I'm a neuroscientist, I'm interested in why. And that's actually something we very rarely ask in trials of mental health treatments. Normally, the question for a mental health treatment trial is, does it work? But we don't ask, how does it work? And that's very important, because then once you get to the answer for how does it work, then you can say, well, actually, for whom is it going to work? Because in reality, mental health conditions are probably more like umbrella terms at the level of the brain and then constituting a variety of different processes that are actually driving the symptoms. And I just had to put this bit at the bottom because everyone thinks endorphins are, they're the thing that are really driving the improvement. I grew up in the 80s, and that's what we thought back then. But it turns out not to be true. Yes, if you take marathon runners and you get them to run a marathon and then you scan their brain at the end, you can see some changes in endorphins. Most of us aren't marathon runners. Most of us don't experience the jogger's high, unfortunately. I wish I did. And there's actually very substantial evidence now that endorphins, so if you block endorphins, people still get the jogger's high at the end, and they certainly don't have this kind of long-term impact in the same way. So we think there's other processes involved. So I don't think it's all about the endorphins. Okay, so what do I think is going on? And what I think is going on is a very important construct in depression, which is motivation. So you'll be familiar probably with the various criteria for depression, the different symptoms, and a key one is called anhedonia, which is a loss of interest or pleasure in previously rewarding activities. And it's very, very commonly comorbid with two other symptoms, fatigue and difficulty in decision-making. And these collectively are known as the interest activity symptoms in the field. They predict poor response to standard antidepressant treatment. That's the figure at the top there, showing that the more of these symptoms you have, the less likely you are to respond to an SSRI, like fluoxetine, for example. And we also know that this experience of things feeling effortful is very, very important in depression. That's what people often tell us. This is why people can't get out of bed. This is why people can't do the cooking and take care of their home, and in some cases have to stop working. And what do we know about the neurobiology of these kinds of processes? Well, we know about an important brain chemical called dopamine, which I'm sure you'll have heard of, and people often think that dopamine equals pleasure, which is not the case. Dopamine does not equal pleasure, but it does equal probably some kind of psychological process around excitement, anticipation, and getting ready for action, basically. And this colourful figure in the middle here just goes to show that it's just to show that in people with Parkinson's disease, as they lose their dopamine neurons, which is what happens as Parkinson's disease progresses, you get this increasing relationship between the amount of dopamine neurons that have been lost and the extent to which people are experiencing these motivational symptoms. So that's where I started getting interested in this, because we'd been researching this idea in depression for about 10 years. And in terms of psychological processes, in terms of motivation, there's lots of different things that we could look at. We can look at people's anticipation. That's a kind of physiological measure. We can look at learning. But in particular, we can look at cost-benefit decision-making. And that's what we've really been focusing on. And why is this interesting? It's interesting because we're doing this all the time, every day. Every time we decide if we're going to make an action, we have to think, is it worth it? Is it worth the effort? Is it worth the potential downside? Is it worth the cost? So we have potential, nice things that we can can get, which psychologists call rewards, and then we discount those, so we sort of take a bit of the value off according to, well, what are the bad things that could potentially happen? And that's happening basically all the time, every single day. But we're not doing it consciously, our brains are doing it for us, and often we're not really aware of this decision-making process. I don't think it's like an explicit deliberative process, but our brains are constantly making this decision, you know, should I engage in this action? Should I put this work in order to get this potential outcome? And that's the lens we're looking at this through. So when we study motivation in the lab, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to come back to physical activity in a minute, we can do things like give people simple computer games where we ask them to exert effort, like squeezing a squeezer like you would at a fairground or something, you know, with hitting the hammer, to raise the amount of lights on the tree here. And basically, we can set up this task where we ask them, well, here's a certain number of apples that you could win. The apples correspond to money. Do you think it's worth the effort and put in the squeeze in order to win this money? And when we do that in depression, what we find is this very characteristic pattern where people who have depression are less willing to put in effort. And again, this is not probably a conscious deliberation. They're just less willing across all levels of effort, all levels of potential reward, to say, yes, I would like to do that challenge in order to get this potential reward. So I want you to hold on to that because we think that's a key component in what is actually driving this low motivation that people with depression experience. And also, I should also say, in other severe mental illness like bipolar and also schizophrenia. So I'm going a little bit fast because I want to get to the meat here, which is coming back to this, you know, physical activity. And in particular, I'm going to shift a bit here to talk specifically about aerobic exercise, because that's where all the really good evidence in depression is, and the really well-controlled trials, but actually it probably applies across the board. So I've just got on the left again, you know, as if you needed the message repeating, another analysis, and this is an aggregate analysis called a meta-analysis, as we heard before from Claire, where you're just looking at the average across lots of different trials. This is a study from about 5 years ago now, but it was very, very well done, and it really picked the best controlled studies that were out there. And it showed a very, very clear effect. Even when you've got really, really clear control conditions where people are not just doing nothing or treatment as usual, where they're actually engaging in some other activity which could plausibly have an antidepressant effect, you see this stonking great effect size. So you can see the effect size there, which is called a standardized mean difference, of about 0.8. And so for antidepressant medication, the equivalent would be about 0.3. And for psychological therapy, the equivalent would be about 0.5. So let me tell you, that is something real when we're looking in mental health. Even lithium is only a little bit big. Lithium for mania is only a little bit bigger than that. In fact, even antibacterial medication for bacterial infection is only a little bit bigger than that. So this is a massive, great effect. So we know it works. And the question is, well, what clues do we have here? Well, one clue is actually about a fundamental link between the brain and the body, because we often think of them as separate to each other, but actually they're intrinsically interlinked. And a key process is inflammation, which is basically activation of the immune system. And many people with depression have chronic inflammation, even in the absence of any infective agent. So, for example, when you get a virus, you get a spike in the inflammation and it tends to come back down again and is very well regulated. That's not what it looks like in depression. People with depression have a kind of low-grade chronic inflammation and it just never goes away again. And this is present probably in at least a third of people with depression. And when you feel like you're infected, when you've got a cold and when you've got a virus, we all intrinsically understand how that feels. You feel like you want to withdraw socially, you want to stop eating, you feel low in motivation, and you feel fatigue. These are all symptoms of depression, right? So you can easily see how this can occur. So here's a fascinating study from a colleague of mine, Livia Carvalho, who looked at incidental infections in a cohort and then the experience of different types of symptoms a couple of years later. This is the one on the top right. And you can see things like lack of enjoyment, feeling like everything was an effort and couldn't get going, was particularly associated with having more than one infection, so on 2 or more occasions in an incidental period, incidentally over a period of about 4 years. So we know that there's this strong relationship between the inflammation in the body and people's mental health. And then thinking back to that effort-based decision task I was showing you before, we can also do this experimentally. So if we give people a bacterial chemical, which is called LPS, we can inject that into people. It's not a nice experiment to do, and that actually activates their immune system because the immune system recognizes this bacterial chemical, and we can show that that reduces people's willingness to engage in effort, which is exactly the profile you'd expect to see from what we all know intuitively of what infections actually feel like. So this is what we came down to, and this is my postdoctoral researcher, Emily Hurd, who wrote this beautiful paper last year around how exercise might be effective in depression. Because another thing that we know about, especially aerobic exercise, is that it's actually anti-inflammatory. So this fundamental link between the mind and the body, and even when you do a relatively mild form of physical activity, even if you're just going for a brisk walk, you can actually see the reduction in inflammation. And inflammation turns out to have this very clear pathway directly into the brain. Not that the virus gets into the brain, because the brain's very good at protecting itself against those kinds of things, but there are these signaling pathways that go up through the brainstem, and in particular they target these brain chemical nuclei, and one of them is this dopamine system, which we know is very important. So experimentally in animals, if you give an inflammatory agent, and even just specific inflammatory compounds, you can actually see a reduction in the dopamine neuron firing. And then we think this dopamine then modulates the circuits that are important in motivation, which is the figure that you can see, which I won't go into the exact details, but there's this very well-characterized circuit for processing motivation in the brain, and we think that leads to people being more willing to exert effort and doing less discounting of rewards. And then finally, and this is a point that's going to be important on the last slide, actually it probably also has an impact on people's cognitive function as well. And why is that? Well, that's because when you do difficult cognitive operations, like trying to remember a phone number or doing a bit of mental arithmetic, actually what you're doing is exerting cognitive effort. So it's not just about physical effort, but also cognitive effort. And it may be that the brain is making this trade-off when we're thinking about cognitive effort and cognitive impairment as to whether engaging in these cognitive processes is kind of worth the effort and worth the reward. So there's a potential link in there with cognitive impairment, which is, of course, a very, very important feature of many severe mental illnesses, in particular schizophrenia. So this is what we've been doing for the last 5 years, and let me tell you that we've been very busy. So I put another great researcher up there, Ashley Selena Davis, who has been working on this, and we've been running randomized controlled trials of physical activity interventions. Initially, and this is called the Life Study, it's called a study because it's not a trial, because it's not in people with a diagnosis, but basically in a student sample, easy for us to access within the university, who have at least a low level, limited level of low mood. So only about 20% of these people would satisfy a diagnosis for depression. And we managed to get 120 of them in to do at least one session of supervised physical activity. And what they do is they either do a kind of gym workout, which is very well controlled, and we can measure their heart rate and everything, or a kind of very mild kind of stretching and relaxation. It's still a type of physical activity, and it could still be effective, at least for some symptoms of depression, but that's not what we really think is going to make the difference. We really think it's the aerobic content here and actually kind of feeling like your heart is getting going, feeling sweaty and feeling out of breath that is making the real difference here. So these are mainly female students. As you can see, they're pretty young, kind of mid-20s, because it's a student sample. And this incredibly complicated design, because what we're trying to do is not just understand, does it work, but actually, how does it work? And then later, that'll help us understand, for whom does it work? Because physical activity is not going to work for everybody, unfortunately. And so what they're doing is they're doing these symptoms every week, and they're doing these cognitive tests like the decision-making tasks that I showed you on a weekly basis, and we're measuring their fitness before and after, and also doing a brain scan right at the end. And it's by doing this kind of interdisciplinary work, we're doing the trial and also doing all of the neuroscientific measurements, that gives us the insight into how it actually works. And so what we do is we kind of monitor that activity over time. So this is just their baseline. This is just to show that they're very physically inactive at the beginning. So you can see a very small segment there in the bottom left, which is their either moderate or vigorous intensity activity levels in a typical day, just that tiny dark green slice of the pie. And you can see in the histograms there, the distributions that actually most of their time is spent, sedentary, basically either sitting in the chair, probably looking at their phone or watching TV. And we can measure this because we have these physical activity monitors, which are a bit like a Fitbit. So they wear these for the whole time during the study. And so what do we see? So we have another great part of the study where we can measure their symptoms on a daily basis using an app, which is really cool. And actually, we get them to do this twice a day. So we use this app called Neureka, and they have these different adjectives, and they just have to say, yes, I'm feeling a lot like this, or not very much like this. And you can see the lines very clearly. So the more positive items, they're sort of towards the top there, and you can see the more negative items, they're sort of towards the bottom. And over the course of the trial, the positive items are all going up, and the negative items are really all going down. So this is really impacting emotions and feelings on a day-to-day basis. And we do actually see quite a subtle signal, but it's there statistically in people feeling kind of enthusiastic. And that's very important with respect to our hypothesis about motivation. And then in terms of the symptoms, we see a really interesting pattern. So actually symptoms get better across a whole different bunch of domains. So we've got people experiencing depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, fatigue symptoms, and also these motivational symptoms, anhedonia symptoms, which I mentioned to you before. And actually these improve in the groups for both the groups of the depression and in the anxiety. Interestingly, not so much with the fatigue, but it's really with respect to these motivational symptoms where we see this differentiation by the end of the study. You can see they're quite similar at the beginning, before they start any interventions, and by the end, so a higher score here indicates less symptoms because it's like a kind of pleasure or motivation scale, that the group who are doing the moderate intensity and moderate to vigorous intensity activity are actually doing better by the end of the study. And this is just in a student sample. And then we're, of course, using this effort-based decision-making task as well in order to understand what's really driving this. And as you can see, very interestingly, we get this very early change in people's willingness to exert effort. So they're reasonably similar before they start the intervention. And then actually only after 1 week, we start to see this very clear differentiation where the people who are doing the aerobic exercise are actually more willing to exert, in this case, the cognitive effort, which is what we've been looking at in this particular task. And then it's sort of like the other group catches up a bit over time. So I'm nearly out of time, and I'm just going to talk to you about, very briefly about what we're doing right now, and that is basically the kind of all whistles and bells, all dancing, all singing version of this study, because previously we did it in college students, and now we've broadened this out, and because of a very generous grant by Wellcome, enabling us to run this massive trial in people recruited through GP surgeries, living in the community, obviously, and some with extremely severe levels of depression. We're about 1/3 of the way through at the moment, so we've randomized 82 out of a target sample of 250. And a very similar design, same conditions, the very active condition, and then this kind of relaxation and stretching condition. But this time we're also taking blood samples to measure the inflammation. We're also taking another type of brain scan in order to directly measure dopamine, which is really exciting. We're measuring stress hormones, which you can get from saliva, and they're still doing these questionnaires every day, and they're still doing the same cognitive test, and now some really very elaborate fitness testing. So in 3 years' time, I will be able to tell you sort of definitively in a very well-characterized population of people with depression whether this, this finding that motivation is one of the key constructs targeted is really holding up. And then finally, because I really am out of time now, I want to talk about other conditions. So fascinatingly, there's almost nothing in bipolar disorder. I found very few studies, probably less than 10 studies ever conducted on physical activity in bipolar disorder, which I think is an extraordinary gap in the literature, and really just 1 or 2 looking at mania. And there's a bit of evidence to suggest that in bipolar disorder, in depression, physical activity is effective, but it's pretty early days. On the other hand, in schizophrenia, there's actually a pretty decent literature, which is the figure that you can see on the right-hand side, actually specifically around cognitive impairment. So it doesn't actually help positive symptoms like hallucinations or delusions. But if you look at standardized cognitive tests, and these are very commonly have a severe impairment in schizophrenia on the order of an effect size of 1 standard deviation, so kind of comparable to the impact of physical activity as an antidepressant. That seems to be improved by physical activity, and there's a really pretty decent, robust evidence base there with about 20 studies, pretty much showing all in the same direction. So I think that's really interesting, and it's actually can't really say it's a prediction because these studies came first, but maybe it's consistent with this idea that maybe what the exercise is doing is changing the kind of cost-benefit analysis the brain is making and making people more willing to engage in the cognitive effort. And that's important sort of conceptually because it's suggesting that actually the ability to do the cognitive tasks is there. It's really a motivational change. So it's not can they do it, but it's do they want to do it? That's how I think about it. And then finally, I think that there's been a huge amount of work in physical activity and aging, and there's really exciting studies starting from about 15 years ago, actually suggesting that we can halt or potentially even reverse the decline in brain cells over time in elderly people. And so that figure with the brain in the middle is showing this region, the hippocampus, which is highly implicated in Alzheimer's disease, very important in memory. Actually, you can see the blue line there going up. That's an increase in the grey matter volume, probably reflecting the kind of extent of the of the connections of the grey matter cells there, if not the cells themselves, in people over a 1-year period, whereas the people in the control group have got the expected decline. And the authors were able to show in that same study, in the bottom of that slide now, a correlation between people's memory performance and the degree of change in the hippocampal volume. So also very important in the elderly population and thinking about neurological disease as well. So as predicted, I have wildly run out of time. This is all the team who are only the team who are involved in the study at the moment. So you can imagine the level of interdisciplinary coordination needed to do this. I've got to thank the funders, Wellcome and the Rose Trees. And Wellcome, our wonderful funder, they like this study so much that they decided to make a podcast about it. So if you're interested in listening to a podcast about physical activity and depression and our study of the LIFE trial, then just scan that QR code and it'll take you to the kind of Wellcome podcast page. And I will finish there, and thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions.